Intro time. Chapter 37. Discovered. Sandra and Carl Tennyson were relaxed people. They had long ago adopted the parenting style that Jen would do what she would do. So long as she wasn't hurting anyone and she wasn't in any danger herself, everything was fine. Except it wasn't fine. Not after what they'd seen her do, turning into a plant-like alien to fight an 8-foot-tall creature. Carl had always known about aliens. His mother was an Anodite, after all. That was hard to keep a secret. Most mothers on Earth didn't float around the house or randomly shed their skin in favor of appearing as a being of pure energy. The first time Sandra found out, Carl had been worried that she would leave him, but she had been, as she was about most things, remarkably relaxed. But when Jen was born, they had agreed that they didn't want her to have anything to do with aliens. It was just too dangerous for their little girl. Their point seemed proven when Jen arrived home that night, after disappearing during the fight despite their attempts to follow her. There had been too much fire and the collapse of a building. She had a shining black eye and a mostly healed cut under her eye a few inches higher, and she might have lost it. Of course, the two of them fretting and panicking did nothing to help the situation. It seemed to be doing nothing more than scaring Jen. Revealing what they'd seen on the street had true fear flashing through her eyes. It only got worse when they questioned her about what had really happened to Grandpa Max. She shut down, sitting on the couch, staring down at her feet like they were responsible for all of her current problems. Sandra spotted it before Carl did. But Sandra was a nurse. She'd seen the signs before. Her daughter, her little girl, had a near textbook case of PTSD. And they had triggered it. Her hands were shaking, she was pale and looked beyond scared. When Carl threatened to remove the Omnitrix, sheer terror blinked through Jen's eyes as her father pulled her to her feet by the arm she wore the Omnitrix on. It was then that Sandra noticed the scar on her wrist she had never seen before. It had to be a few years old, as it was heavily faded. She caught her daughter's hand, pulling her away from her father for the moment, so the scar was in direct light. When did this happen? She kept her voice calm and level. Using her nursing voice on her daughter wasn't something she often did, but she didn't want to scare her more than she already had. She seemed to have done the right thing, though, as Jen tensed, but then quickly deflated like a burst balloon. When I was 10. A warlord named Vilgax wanted the Omnitrix. He tried to take my hand off with it. Her response was so quiet that even though both adults were quiet, they almost didn't hear her. But despite Sandra's glare, Carl still tried to take off the watch, breaking most of his power tools and 6 saw blades in the process. Sandra sent Jen off to bed after that. She had to talk to her husband. Jen made up her mind the minute the door clicked closed behind her. She emptied her school bag and began to refill it. She took the holoviewers Grandpa Max had left behind. She took the recorder Azimuth had given her, and the hoverboard she'd gotten from Albrassix. She had no idea what had happened to the one from Tetrax. It was probably still in the rust bucket somewhere. She stuffed a few changes of clothing into her bag. For a moment she thought about getting her toothbrush, but she didn't want her parents to catch her. Instead, she snatched up a pen and paused again. What was she supposed to say? She'd lied to keep her parents safe for 5 years, but that didn't change the fact that she had indeed lied to them. She could hear them down the hall. They were arguing. She shook her head and scribbled down 2 words on a piece of paper from her desk. She set the paper down on her pillow and pulled her phone out of her pocket, tossing it down onto the bed next to her pillow. She pulled open the window and pulled the hoverboard out of her bag. On her shoulder, she hopped aboard, thankful to her few very lucky stars for the low cloud cover tonight, as she took off into the night. Sandra tapped softly on her daughter's door. "Jen, sweetie, I have dinner." She didn't answer. "I know there's more to this whole Omnitrix thing than you're telling us so far. I'd like to know the whole story. Your father was trying to help you when you tried to take it off. You know he would never hurt you." The silence persisted. "Jen, sweetie?" Sandra gently opened the door. The room was empty. The large window was hanging open. The plate fell from her fingers, shattering on the floor. Carl was there in moments. He'd been on edge since he'd seen his little girl, his only child, fighting that giant creature downtown. He spotted the note first. He picked it up in trembling hands and held it out to Sandra. "I'm sorry," was all it said, scribbled in Jen's familiar and famously bad handwriting. Jen had run away. Kevin had just finished eating when the pounding on his door began. He stood and made his way over to it as the noise persisted. I'm coming, no need to bust my door down." He paused to absorb the metal of his doorknob in case he needed a quick weapon. You could never tell in this neighborhood. He was not expecting to find Jen at his door. "I thought we were meeting at the waterfront." Jen pushed past him as he released the metal on his hand. It was then he noticed that the brunette was in tears. "What happened?" "My parents saw us fighting the Hybrid. They know about the Omnitrix." Her voice was shaking. "Well, they saw me fighting the Hybrid. I don't know if they saw you, and they didn't say anything about Gwen, but they tried to take it off." She was shaking like a leaf. "I couldn't go to Gwen. Uncle Frank and Auntie Natalie would have just sent me home, and it would have gotten her in trouble, too, because they only know about her powers, not the whole saving the world thing, and the rust bucket is the first place they'll look. I didn't know where else to go." Her voice cracked as she slumped onto his couch, tears streaming down her face. Kevin nodded. "Okay, lose the jacket." Jen looked up at him, confused, on top of fresh tears. "What?" "Lose the jacket. You wear it basically every day. They go to the cops to report you missing, it'll be the first thing they describe. You can't stay here either, it's the first place Gwen will look." He pulled his phone out of his pocket and dialed a number. "Hey, Coop, you still got that spare room?" "Not for me, for Jen. She'll explain when she gets there." "Thanks, man." Jen took off her jacket as Kevin disappeared into his room, re-emerging with a black hoodie that he tossed to her. "Keep the hood on that up. Anyone see you coming here?" Jen shook her head. "I hoverboarded, so no. Low cloud cover tonight." "What about the Hybrid?" "Let Gwen and I do some recon on the waterfront tonight." He rummaged in a box, tossing Jen a phone very similar to his own. "It's a burner, but I'm assuming you remember your cousin's number?" Jen nodded. "Answer when it rings." "I remember the number for that phone. Hoodie on, come on." Jen nodded as she pulled the hoodie on. It was about 2 sizes too big for her, but hid her well. The only disadvantage was that it didn't allow for easy access to the Omnitrix. But she grabbed her bag and headed out the door with Kevin. She'd clearly come to the right place, but he would know how to run away and not be found. He'd done it once, after all. They arrived at Cooper's house, and Kevin nodded for her to get out. "I'll meet Gwen on the waterfront. We'll do recon. If it looks serious, I'll call the burner. You and Coop can work on your little project you got going. I'll let Gwen in on what's happening, and we'll figure out what to do, okay?" Jen nodded and paused as she made to get out of the car. She turned back and hugged Kevin. It was brief, light, and made slightly awkward by the fact that he was still buckled into the car. But it was the first time she'd done that. "Thanks, Kevin." "Don't mention it." She nodded, grabbing her bag and heading inside. Chapter 38. Testing. As it turned out, Jen had arrived at Cooper's house just the same time Arjit did. And she was glad she had. It let her avoid answering questions as to why she was here and staying for the moment. Mrs. Daniels let her drop off her bag and handed her a sandwich as she headed out to Cooper's shed. The sandwich was quickly scarfed down. She had missed dinner at home, after all. Her heart gave a twist as Arjit grinned at her. "Jenny!" "Don't call me that." "Sorry." Arjit raised his hands in surrender. "I got what you paid for. I gotta know, though. Where'd you get that much date night?" "None of your business. How many did you get?" "For you, sweetness, 4. Jen raised an eyebrow as Arjit produced a slightly familiar-looking cube from his pocket. Kev was kind enough to provide some equipment for hauling them around. They should be asleep for a few more hours. Listen, you ever need a job done, call me. Nobody in our circles trusts Kev anymore since he's running with you and has gone all official plumber, like his pups. So, you ever need any more, shall we say, questionably acquired materials, you call me." "I'll keep that in mind, Arjit." He tossed her the cube and saluted before shoving his hands in his pockets and kicking the ground lightly. "You wouldn't happen to be up to anything tomorrow night?" He asked it almost shyly. "Arjit, you're kind of cute, but I have an invasion of Earth to put a stop to. I'm going to be busy for a while." Arjit blinked at her. "Really? You think I'm cute?" He bounced slightly. So maybe after you do your save the world thing. I don't have Gwen's things for bad boys, but if I need anything less than legal, you'll be the first I call. Argent grinned at her. I can live with that. See you around, Jen. He took off, a wide grin on his face. Cooper looked over at Jen. He'd stayed quiet through their little conversation. You really think Argent is cute? Meh, he's alright. Keep in mind, I turned into a literal pile of goo. I don't really care what people look like. I wouldn't date Argent because he's a scumbag. Cooper nodded slightly and showed her the way into the basement he'd built. There was a containment chamber and a ton of equipment down there. Cooper eyed the cube in her hand. You know how to use that. Jen shrugged. I've seen someone use it before. Once, a very long time ago, she'd seen Tetrax use one just like this to trap 2 bounty hunters Vilgax had hired to bring him the Omnitrix. She opened the door to the containment room and tossed the cube in. It glowed and grew, then shrank, leaving 4 DNAliens behind. 3 of them were cuffed with energy cuffs, likely the ones Kevin had gotten from the Forever Knights when they dealt with the dragon. The 4th was tied with simple ropes. Jen nodded as she took off Kevin's hoodie and tossed it at Cooper, who caught it. We'll start with the one most likely to break loose first. She tucked the containment cube into her pocket and dragged the DNAlien around the chamber. She set 3 of them against the wall. The one tied with rope she left in the middle of the chamber. She turned to Cooper. You need anything before we get started? This could take a while. Gwen says it took about 5 minutes the first time, and she doesn't know when I started to give an accurate time on how long it took to cure your mom. Cooper nodded and tossed Kevin's hoodie onto a chair. He pulled a box from the drawer on the desk. He'd moved down here. From the box, he produced several electrodes. He raised an eyebrow at Jen, who nodded. He placed one on the side of her forehead, one next to the Omnitrix. He handed her the 3rd. This one goes over the heart. He blushed slightly as he turned away to the DNAlien to give it a similar treatment. Jen pulled down the collar of her shirt and placed the final electrode. These need to be wired to anything? Cooper shook his head. Nah, I made them. Completely wireless. Took an old Bluetooth link-up I had and repurposed it. You ready? Jen nodded at him and stepped back into the containment room as Cooper stepped out of it and closed the door behind him, sealing the chamber. There were vents for air, all rigged with knockout gas should anything go wrong. Cooper looked slightly nervous, but Jen shot him the thumbs up and turned to the DNAlien on the floor. She took a deep breath and held the Omnitrix over the DNAlien. This time, it beeped before she could tell it what to do. Genetic anomaly detected. Attempt to repair? Jen nodded. Yes. She laid her hand on the DNAlien, and Cooper watched in amazement as circuit lines like those on a motherboard appeared on Jen's skin. He glanced down at his screens, and his eyes went wide. Jen, get off that thing now! No response. He wasn't sure what he'd been expecting. The electrode on the side of her forehead was reading her brain activity, and it had spiked like nothing he'd ever seen before. Well beyond normal safe ranges for a human. But then he glanced at her other vitals, terrified he was going to see them bottom out. But they held steady, almost too steady, as if she was in stasis. No change in her breathing or heart rate, nothing but the massive spike in brain activity. Whatever she was doing wasn't hurting her. The DNAlien, on the other hand, was spiking all over the charts. Something was happening on the atomic level there. His computers were picking it up, though. The DNA was unraveling, and the remnants of the human DNA were being pieced back together. It was sort of beautiful. In moments, the green retreated, and Jen caught the sleeping human in one arm, the lifeless xenocyte in her other hand. Gwen was not happy. Jen had run away from home to Kevin, because he was the only one she could think of to go to. Kevin had told her all about this when he picked her up from her house to check out the waterfront. She could not believe how stupid her cousin was being. She liked it even less when they arrived back at her house after the skirmish on the waterfront. They'd almost been overwhelmed by DNAliens, but Gwen had managed a teleportation spell she'd been practicing and gotten them out to the car before they could be completely overwhelmed. But she was exhausted. She was not looking to get into another fight, but that seemed to be what she walked into as she stepped into her house and found her Aunt Sandra and Uncle Carl on the couch. Sandra was in tears, and Carl was staring into his coffee like he was looking for all the answers of the universe. Her mother was trying to comfort Sandra, and her father was standing next to Carl, but turned when he heard the door close behind her. "Gwen, come sit down." Her father used a tone that brooked no arguments. He was using his lawyer voice. Jen was a dead woman when Gwen got her hands on her. But she did as she was told. She sat in the armchair nearest Uncle Carl. They were all silent for a moment. Carl spoke first. "Jen ran away." Gwen did her best to look shocked. "Why?" Her father gave her a look somewhere between accusatory and searching. "Her parents found out about her extracurricular activities. Gwen, did you know your cousin was off fighting 8-foot-tall aliens and saving the world?" Gwen wanted desperately to strangle her cousin for leaving her to take care of this. She was silent. She didn't want to lie to her parents. She slumped in her chair. "Yes, I knew. I've been helping her." Carl frowned at her, finally looking up from his coffee. "How?" Gwen raised her eyebrows at her father, who looked to the side slightly guiltily. "You didn't tell Uncle Carl." Frank shook his head. Gwen sighed and raised her hand, letting it glow. "I inherited Grandma Verdona's spark. Well, that's what she calls it, anyway." Carl seemed to sink deeper into the couch in despair. "So Mom knew the whole time?" Frank nodded at his brother. Gwen shook her head. "Only for a few months. I mean, about me. It's possible she knew about the Omnitrix. A lot of aliens do. Jen's sort of famous." Sandra and Carl both looked at her incredulously. Gwen raised her hands in defense. "I'm serious. The Omnitrix is a one-of-a-kind piece of technology, and she set out on a long explanation of what Kevin termed the acid trip summer. It took a long time to tell them everything she knew, and she knew she didn't know all of it. Jen had been on her own several times. Gwen had been unable to help for the first bit of the summer, having only awakened her spark with the assistance of the charms of the Zell. When she reached the day Vilgax had kidnapped Jen and attempted to forcibly remove the Omnitrix, Carl went pale. It hadn't been a good day. Gwen and Grandpa Max had crashed the rust bucket into Vilgax's ship, but had nearly been too late. It was just Grandpa Max's forethought that had saved Jen's life. He'd taken the gun from Mount Rushmore and given Gwen a vial of experimental medical nanobots. The job to make sure Jen got out alive while he dealt with Vilgax. If it hadn't been for those nanobots, Jen wouldn't have survived what Vilgax had already done. She still carried the scar along her torso, and the one on her arm from where Vilgax had been about to sever her arm when he realized he was beaten and his ship destroyed. If the Omnitrix hadn't malfunctioned at that moment and turned her into Diamond Head, Jen would have lost both the Omnitrix and her arm. Carl set down his mug and buried his head in his hands. Sandra had collected herself somewhat. "No wonder she ran away." "No wonder she ran away," Carl whispered, but they all heard him. "What do you mean?" Gwen asked, a little concerned. Her cousin was tough as nails, but she had been through a lot in 15 short years. Though she didn't often show it, it had affected her quite a bit. "I tried to take the Omnitrix off her." Carl sounded utterly defeated. Gwen stared at him, disbelief in her eyes. "You can't." Carl nodded. "I noticed that. It broke most of my tools. Didn't leave a scratch on the watch." Gwen shook her head hard. "No, that's not what I mean." The adults all stared at the teen as she took a deep breath. "She and the watch are a part of each other." The adults gave her a blank look. Gwen pursed her lips and nodded to herself. She raised a hand and let the pink glow spread through the room. It touched each person in turn, and they glowed a slightly different shade of pink. "What you're seeing is called an aura. Every living being has one, and everyone's is slightly different. But a normal life energy is pink, in some shade or another. Grandma Verdona and I talked about this. Jen's is green." Sandra frowned. "Does that mean something bad? Is my little girl going to be okay?" Gwen shook her head. "She's fine. The way Grandma explained it, Jen is the only human with a green aura. The watch did that. It's alive, but not in the way we think of life, and it fused with her on a level so deep that even I wouldn't be able to pick out one from the other. I don't think she can ever take off the watch, not without it hurting her or worse. Gwen flinched as her Uncle Carl's shoulders began to shake. Sandra had fresh tears in her eyes. I never meant... We never... Carl fell silent. Gwen nodded. I know that. Jen is going through a lot right now. Sandra's eyes narrowed slightly. Like? Gwen sighed. Did you let her explain anything that happened? Sandra nodded slightly. She told us what the Omnitrix does, at least in part. She didn't tell us it was alive. Gwen shrugged. I don't know if she knows. She might. She's more connected to it than anyone else in the universe, but did she tell you anything that's been happening? Carl shook his head as Frank sat down next to his brother. No, we didn't really give her the chance. We asked about your grandpa. We know he's involved somehow, but he paused. Your grandmother told us he's missing. Gwen flinched and was silent for a moment as her uncle continued. She shut down when we asked. That's about when I tried to take the Omnitrix from her. He looked around, down at his shoes, shame in his eyes. Frank wrapped an arm around his brother. Grandpa Max isn't missing. He's gone, Gwen said, trying to keep her voice calm. She launched into the explanation of what had happened at Santa Mira before anyone could stop her. She got through the whole story before she broke down. Her mother hugged her close, rocking slightly as Carl turned to Frank. Dad, Neither man could find the words. They hugged each other, and Sandra patted her husband on the back. They were silent for a moment. Then Carl turned back to Gwen. You know where Jen is now? We just want to talk to her. Gwen shook her head. It was the only thing Kevin hadn't told her. No, but I have a number to call. Sandra nodded slightly. We just want to know that she's okay. Gwen nodded and pulled out her phone, pulling up the number Kevin had given her. The buzzing was getting on Cooper's nerves. They had moved on to DNAlien number 2. His mom was looking after the still sleeping human that had been the first one. Jen was back to the pure green-eyed stasis mode the Omnitrix put her in while she cured the DNAliens. Cooper was copying the programming running through her. As the buzzing kept going, he waved a hand at the hoodie Jen had been wearing, and a phone floated out of the pocket over to his ear, answering the call as he did so. Jen Tennyson's phone, who may I say was calling? He almost lost connection as Gwen's voice came over the other side of the line. Cooper? He just managed to catch the gun he was programming with the data currently running through Jen's veins, even if he wasn't sure how that worked. Hey, Gwen, how's life? I need you to put Jen on the phone. Cooper looked over at the containment unit. The time to transit the data, they had to go... This time, to transmit the data, they'd had to go a bit more old school. Jen and the DNAlien were currently wired to a hard line Cooper had set up. I would love to, but I can't right now. She's busy. Busy as in... The computer beeped rapidly. Cooper glanced at the readings. Jen was about to finish up. They needed to get this reading done now. Sorry, Gwen, I have to go. Don't... He hung up on her, flinching. Well, there goes my shot there, he muttered as his fingers flew across the keys of his computer. This had better work.